Welcome to another edition of Geopolitics and Empire. A quick reminder to support the broadcast. It's crucial, very important that you do that. The best way to support Geopolitics and Empire is becoming a paid subscriber on Substack, $5 or more a month, or $50 or more a year. We do private weekly Zoom calls with members only, which are a lot of fun. People from all over the world join, where we shoot the breeze on current events. You can also buy me a coffee, send reinforcements through donor box, purchase a consultation with me. I've got people consulting with me. They're selling their homes and moving down to Mexico and Latin America. Or if you just want to shoot the breeze with me, you can buy a consultation that helps the podcast. And do check out my affiliates. I've got a brand new affiliate, easydns.com. Mark Yeftovich is the CEO, and I just switched my domain over to them. And so if you purchase hosting or domains or other services from easydns.com, you can use my coupon code Geopolitics. You'll get 15% off. They've been around since 1998. They do work for the government, and the CEO is liberty-minded, and I would rather pay a premium in this day and age to use someone like EasyDNS for peace of mind and a personalized service. And do check out Legal Shield and Wise Wolf Gold and Above Phone as well, my other affiliates. Returning to the transmission it's been too long. It's been like something like 2 years. Visiting fellow at Mathias Corvinus Collegium in Hungary, and I call him the supreme analyst, Ralph Schoellhammer. Welcome back, Ralph.
Well, thanks so much for having me. And I can only reinforce what you just said. Please, everybody who's watching or listening to this, subscribe to Geopolitics and Empire. It's a fantastic podcast, and we really need these independent contributors like you, these independent content producers, because there is so much out there, and there's such a limited number of like long form formats, right, where we can really discuss all these issues in greater detail. So, $5 a month. I mean, that's absolutely doable. That's a cappuccino and a croissant. Maybe even that's even less than a cappuccino and croissant if you're in Europe. So it's definitely worth your while. Great, congratulations also for a move to Substack. I think that is the platform of the future. I'm not there yet, but I think this is the best move you could have made. And everybody who doesn't yet have a Substack account, either as a reader or a content producer, I just say check it out. I think it's better. It's friendlier. It's more in detail than X or Twitter. You will have more engaging and productive exchanges. So congratulations on everything you do, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, thanks for that. Substack is great for me now. I've seen it didn't work for some people. It's working for me, and it's a great network that I'm leveraging, and I think that's what we have to do today. Leverage all the networks, in decentralized fashion. X, LinkedIn, Substack, Telegram, whatever you can. This is decentralized guerrilla warfare, as I like to call it, information warfare. And I was listening to your recent talk you were with Kim Iverson. She's been on the podcast. I remember she reached out to me first a couple of years back when she was still on the Hill, and she covered my deplatforming from PayPal. And I wanted to get you on to talk about Europe. You're based in out there in Europe, and just to read a few things here. Former French ambassador Gerard Araud, he tweeted out. He said, "Quote: I fear my U.S. friends would ask me to explain them what is happening in France. Too complicated, too unpredictable, too absurd, too pathetic, too disappointing. At the same time, they would answer me, it's not better in their country and in most Western democracies. So it doesn't really look good in the West, but sort of what's your pulse? What's happening now in Europe in the aftermath of these elections?"
So there's one metaphor I like to use, and bear with me. I hope it's not too stupid, but for me, it always helps to kind of start the conversation. For me, it feels like that Europe is a little bit like an ocean liner who has been cruising towards an iceberg. And it seems that now the crew has seen the iceberg, and that they say, oh my God, we have to change course. But apparently not everybody on board wants to do this. And now it seems that they have taken over the rudder for now. And they are frantically trying to steer it, and very slowly, as an ocean liner is going to tries to move away, change course, to move away from the iceberg. And I would say it's not yet clear whether or not we will avoid the full frontal collision, or if it will just be a scratch, or if we can make the full turnaround. I think this is a little bit the situation in which Europe finds itself at the moment. There is something going on. I sincerely believe, and I know this is a little bit of an old trope, but I think that in 20, 25, 30 years, the last couple of years will be interpreted as historical moments. Whether it's going to be, in hindsight, great, positive historical moments, or some more tragic historical moments, we will see. But something is going on. Like, obviously, I think what you just mentioned, what's going on in France, I mean, these are significant events. I think what's going on, maybe something we can get into a little bit in more detail, what's happening in Italy, kind of what's happened all over Europe, but all over the West and other places in the world, right? You can see there are political shifts in all kinds of areas. And I think some of the ideas of the past are now colliding with reality. Just to give you one example, I'm sure we're going to talk about this also in greater detail, which is significant, right? When the end of low interest rates, the end of cheap money. The reason why I'm mentioning this is because over the last decades, kind of a lot of the economy in the West, but not just in the West, by the way, has been what I would call zombified. And what I mean by this is, right, you had banks, you had companies that were kept afloat basically by free money. Right? They got cheap credits, they got cheap loans. Very often they got government money. I think, for example, the renewable sector to a large extent falls into this category. But now as things are getting more expensive, basically, ironically, on the one hand, we have inflation, which means that money has no worth anymore. But on the other hand, of course, since it is more difficult to get money because of high interest rates, it also adds actually value to money. So it's a very complex situation. I've been talking to people. I'm sure that many of your viewers and listeners are familiar with, like with Doomberg, whom you had on your show, who is fantastic, with Luke Groman, with a handful of others, and pretty much everybody agrees in saying, this is uncharted territory. And what's currently going on, everybody is in debt because money was so cheap or loans were so cheap in the past. And now you have this raise in interest rates. So there's a complete reorientation in many areas of the global economy as well. And it is not as of yet clear who will come out on top, right? There are those who say it's the end of the dollar, it's the end of the West, it's going to be the era of the BRICS. Possible, right? Nothing can be ruled out. But at the same time, BRICS countries are also under pressure, right? China is not as transparent as they could be, but the things that we do know that come out of China is that they're also in trouble. I'm not like Peter Zeihan and saying China will collapse in the next 7 months, but they have issues they need to take care of, just as everybody has. So we're in an interesting competition globally as who will be the first in kind of solving some of the major structural problems. If I would have to make an assessment, who is, let's say, in the best starting conditions. And, this is not fanboying for any country, but just kind of looking at what's there on the ground. I still believe that for now, the United States are in a kind of advantageous position, not because they have great political leadership. We can talk about this as well, because I don't think they do. But they are just so lucky in other areas, right? They're swimming on a sea of hydrocarbons, of cheap energy. They have friendly neighbors to the south and to the north, more or less. I guess we can talk about the southern border as well. But the risk of an invasion or of war between the US and Mexico, I would say, is close to zero. And of course, in the west and in the east, they have two massive oceans, which has a similar effect. They are doing pretty good work in the area of artificial intelligence. If we will have to find out whether this is just a hype or if it really is everything that some of us are expecting that it might be. I'm open to see what's going to happen with this. They are moving, interestingly, also in the energy area in other directions. The Secretary of Energy, Jennifer Granholm, just christened 2 new reactors in Georgia. And she said, her words, not mine. She said, 2 down, 189 to go. So there are many things that would have been not possible in the past. Michigan, for example, is bringing back a mothballed nuclear reactor. So these are all just symptoms that show that something is going on. Secondly, I think who is also well positioned would be China. Still, I think we completely underestimate when the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese leadership put their mind towards something, they are capable of achieving it, right? They have showed this, for example, in the renewable sector, right? They wanted to be the number one in the production of solar panels and wind turbines, and they managed to do it. They wanted to become number one in electric vehicles. They managed to do it, right? They wanted to be number one in the refining of rare earth and other crucial minerals. They did it, right? So I think this, and by the way, I think the same will be true in semiconductors and microchips. I think it is entirely delusional to believe that the Chinese will not crack that code either. If they put their mind to it, right, they will do their own research, they will bribe, they will steal intellectual property, they will do whatever they deem necessary to reduce their dependency on Taiwan and on others. So I would not underestimate the Chinese either. The last ones in all of this, unfortunately, as always, I think are the Europeans. I think the Europeans remain the most delusional ones. I think, ironically, I'm sure you hear this on your show all the time, so I hate to be one of those who says it as well. But, everybody always refers to Fukuyama's end of history thesis. But I think the one place in the world that still believes we live in the end of history, kind of 1990s world, are the Europeans. And you also saw this a little bit during the elections to the European Parliament. If you listen to what Ursula von der Leyen, right, the president of the European Commission and kind of therefore more or less the executive heart of the European Union, when you hear her talk about her vision for the future, right, it's basically all green deals and and more regulation and how we're basically going to regulate the European Union to top place in the world. And we all know that this is not going to happen, right? We know that from demographics, which other countries have similar problems, of course, but to innovation, to production, to energy, Europe is in deep trouble. I mean, to give you one example, the 30 largest companies in the German stock exchange together are just as capitalized as Nvidia alone is in the United States. Now, again, I think what happened with Nvidia, there's a lot of politics involved as well. This is not just because it's a fantastic company, which it also is. So there's a little bit more going on. But it shows you, it shows you a little bit that kind of the European economy is not where it's supposed to be. And if you look at the companies in Europe, with few exceptions, there are always exceptions to all of this. So we're looking at the broader trend here. But if you look at the broader trend, many of the European companies are old companies. I mean, Siemens are great companies. Like, these are all fantastic companies, but it shows you there is nothing new, right? There is no European Facebook, no European Amazon, no European Alibaba. So kind of we really missed the boat in many of the 21st century technologies. And that is, of course, at some point, this is going to have a negative effect. And this is what I think we gradually see now happening in Europe. And I think that people gradually realize it. So this is all part of the, changing the ocean liner's course. And kind of figuring out what's going to happen in the next 10 to 15 years. I think podcasts like yours, this is what we try to do. So, full disclosure, I have no crystal ball, so I can be very wrong on many of those issues. But very often, I think there is a hype in either one or the other direction. And I think we should be careful with those hypes in either direction. So those who say China is going to collapse, I don't think they're going to collapse anytime soon. But the same goes for the United States, right? The United States, I think, is not going to collapse soon either. Right? They talk about, will they descend into civil war and everything? Civil unrest after the next election, absolutely possible. Civil war, I think that's one step too far. I don't think that's likely for the very reason, the right is all the guns and the left doesn't. So I think this would be a very one-sided civil war if it should truly happen, if you kind of want to play that hypothetically. Europe, on the other hand, I think is different. If Europe does not change course quickly and significantly, this could be, the beginning of the descent into the long sunset with all the potential political, social, and cultural repercussions in a negative sense that would entail.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of your assessment. I want to get back to Frau Ursula Gertrude von der Leyen, but you mentioned the European economy. Just a quick question on that. Boots on the ground. What is your feeling when it comes to this inflation? We all know about the whole Great Reset project. Inflation is raging, and I feel like that's one of the tools being used to wipe out the middle class. On top of all of these crazy taxes that they're laying on us, in Canada now, they're this capital gains. In the U.S., they're ready to also put in this, capital gains tax, which is insane. The green carbon taxes, and so, what's your sense of how expensive is it now in Europe for the average middle class European?
Well, I mean, prices have got, just like in the United States, even though there are still some who claim it's not true. No, prices have gone up significantly. I mean, just recently, I think Reuters had a very interesting, yes, it was Reuters. No, it was Bloomberg, actually, my bad. Had a very interesting article on kind of average costs for German households. And they're significantly higher than they have been in the past. So yes, it's true that you can still get, if you have a good cell phone provider, good, service provider, you can get your iPhones, cheaper than you did in the past. But you don't buy a new iPhone every month, but you buy groceries every second day. So if your grocery prices go up, if your energy prices go up, that hurts you significantly more than if some tech gadgets get cheaper or if the prices stay the same. And the other thing, of course, which I think is equally important, is there is a sense of, if you will, of defeat in many ways, right? A frustration, a kind of that nothing. How to put this? So everybody seems to kind of curl up in the fetal position and refuses to move for lack of a better expression. And I think the reason for this, and you touched upon this already a little bit, let's dive a little deeper into what is the Great Reset in many ways, right? So I think there is the kind of well-known Klaus Schwab and the World Economic Forum and Davos. But of course, if we kind of have to define it as what is it at its core, right? At the core, the idea is, I'm saying it a little bit in a polemic way, but I think I'm not entirely wrong. At the core, it's that 99% of the people are incapable of taking care of themselves. Therefore, you need some either powerful institution or the state or a group of shadowy individuals, whatever it is, kind of to live lives for them, kind of to decide for them what to do because they're just too stupid. It's the whole, Yuval Harari kind of thing that, the 99% of the people will be useless. And I think it didn't say 9, but I think it was like 2/3 of the people in the future will be useless, and we have to find something for them to do. Now, if you create, or if you kind of go towards creating these conditions, I think there are a lot of unintended consequences. And I think the first one is it turns out that no matter how smart these people think they are, they aren't. And this is what you see now happening in Europe, right? This is precisely this. You had this situation where they honestly believe that if you just create an ever more regulatory framework, that somehow the outcome will be a more dynamic and more successful and more creative economy. And of course, the outcome is the exact opposite. Because what the idea behind this is that somebody like Ursula von der Leyen, who in her entire life never really worked in private industry, who has no idea how private industry or anything works, who has been a politician all her life, knows better than actual people who work in the economy. And the outcome, I think, is precisely what we are seeing. And this is, of course, also infused with a lot of ideology that comes out of this Great Reset kind of thinking, right? That we need to degrow the economy, that we need these green deals to save the environment, when everybody knows that even if we would do these green deals, they wouldn't save the environment, and we can go into greater detail there as well. And I think that is really what we're struggling against, that the more we see that these powerful institutions cannot solve the issues, their argument is not, we should take a step back, we can't do it. Their argument is, we need even more power. And I think this is always the problem, right? So they then say, okay, the reason why this is not working is not because we don't know what we're doing or we have too much power. No, they say we don't have enough power. So give us even more, right? And give us even more. And so the regulation, the bureaucracy becomes ever more. And at some point, you really can't do anything anymore. And we can go into detail there as well. But what I really find frustrating, and I think this is something that many of your viewers and listeners should know as well, we can't really build anything anymore. And we don't just to add on to this, very often we also no longer have actual builders in government. I mean, look at the types that are very often these days in politics. It's lawyers, it's people who work for consulting firms, it's the kind of Rishi Sunak types, right? And I have no personal problem with Rishi Sunak, but I think it's a good explanation why things are the way they are, because these are people who manage things, but they have no idea how to manufacture things. And then you end up with a society that once was capable, to give you an example from the United States, which I still find the most impressive, right? You had a society that once managed during a Great Depression to build the Empire State Building in 18 months. You couldn't do that today, because you would need 10,000 environmental impact studies, and then you needed an environmental impact study about the environmental impact study, and then there might be some bug somewhere close by that needs to be protected, so you have to make a bug impact study as well. And then 15 years later and 10,000 lawyer bills later, maybe you have the chance to lay the first brick that then might not be environmentally sustainable, so you have to tear it down again and make the whole thing out of wood or whatever. And that is really a problem. Or take in the United States something like the interstate highway system that was built under Eisenhower. You couldn't. It's impossible to do that today. There are plenty of these stories nowadays, right? When they try to build high-speed rail, whether it's in California or whether it's in the United Kingdom or whether it's continental Europe, right? You hear them these stories after 10 years and 5 billion, whatever, right? We managed to build 200 meters of rail. I'm exaggerating slightly, although there's one example for your viewers to look it up. I think it took them at a subway station in Britain. It took them 10 years to build stairs and to make it, I think, wheelchair accessible. And they were like super proud. It cost, I think, 20 million pounds to basically build stairs in half a decade or almost a decade overall, if you take all the pre-run times into it. And these are societies in decline. And I think that's the main sign that something is in decline if you can no longer do anything. And everybody who is in power, right, is adding on to the impossibility to get anything done. And that's, I think, the biggest problem. And yes, this is driven, I think you pointed in the right direction. This is driven by this idea that there is a perfect blueprint, and the eggheads in Davos know what the blueprint is supposed to look like. And it's simply not working. And as it happens so often, right, if you see your plan failing, if you see that your plan is not according to reality, you don't change the plan. You accuse reality of not reacting as you tell it to. So you double down, and actually that makes things worse. And I think this is kind of where we find ourselves at the moment.
I don't know if you saw the news this week in Barcelona. They're offering the world's first master's program in degrowth.
In degrowth, yes.
Political ecology, degrowth, and environmental justice. Absolute madness. And everything you say in the West, it's it's a scam, grift, and collapse. It's like what you just outlined is a phase of collapse. We can't build anything. And von der Leyen, you tweeted out, this was interesting. You said, quote, "Is this what a loser looks like? Madame Degrowth is celebrating because she knows that the establishment stayed in power. History rang the alarm on Europe, but its people decided to hit the snooze button and roll over. There was a choice, and we blew it again." And I want to look at sort of the negative first. And you mentioned there are some positive changes, but it still seems that we can't shake this technocratic EU, supranational Brussels beast. Von der Leyen and her ilk. They're at the helm. And any thoughts on that?
No, I think you're right. It's a little bit, as I said before, like it's a car that is moving towards a cliff, and everybody who sits in the car is debating which radio station we should put in and whether we should go over the cliff at 100 miles per hour or 120 miles per hour. And there's maybe one or two guys in that car that says, you know what, maybe we should not focus on the radio station and how fast we go over the cliff. Maybe we should make a U-turn and get away from the cliff. And everybody is shouting over those two guys who actually have the right idea. And this is for me how it feels a little bit in the European political debate. And I'll tell you precisely what I mean by this. Yes, right? There is among Europe's right-wing parties, I refuse to call them far-right because I think that's a meaningless term by now, but do they have a fringe? They absolutely do. Right? Do they have a fringe that have, particularly when it comes to historical events, some questionable views? I think that's also correct, but I don't think that's the majority of these parties, just as I don't think that everybody in a left-leaning party is, hoping for the return of Joseph Stalin, but almost every left-leaning party has their sympathizers for Stalin and Lenin among their midst. I mean, this is how political parties work. There's always a radical element to it. But if I look at everything that is relevant for what's happening now, I am of the conviction, again, I can be wrong here, but I'm of the conviction that many of the right-wing parties actually have ideas and have programs that are very much in line with what has to be done. But we always then have debates like it happened with the Alternative for Germany, right? When then a politician says something, about the SS, not every member of the Waffen-SS was a criminal. Now, my problem with this is, and you could have a historical debate about this, right? Because I also think that not every member of any kind of bad institution in human history, right? There are always people, as you mentioned before, there are some people who join out of conviction. Some people join because it helps with their job. Some people join because they have to do it to get a better position. They do it because their friends do it, particularly with large institutions. I don't think that every party member, for example, of the Bolshevik Party in the Soviet Union was necessarily on board with everything that Lenin did, right? That's not, again, the organization itself can still be criminal, but that doesn't mean that every single member is equally guilty of criminality. As I said, and I think you can have then this very elaborate conversation about these institutions within Nazi Germany. It's a little bit, I would say, not smart by a politician, because you do know if somebody asks you such a question, they try to set you up. I mean, this is the setup. If you have a conversation, somebody all of a sudden says, so what's your take on the SS? You know that they're fishing for something, right? So if he would just have said, I'm a politician in the year 2024, this is an intriguing question, but I'll leave it to historians that know much more about this than I do. Done, right? And he moves on. But he has to say something. And then all of a sudden, and you know that then debate will only be around this, that nobody talks about the actual program of the party anymore. Then it's all about what is their tendency, what is their attitude towards, Germany between 1933 and 1945. And I think this is something, again, that is not irrelevant, but it has no meaning for what's happening today. I mean, again, these are interesting historical debates. Or the same we saw in Italy with Giorgia Meloni, who I still think is a big surprise for many. It's the same thing. Well, she comes out of a neo-fascist movement, and in her youth she was in a quasi-fascist movement. That might all be true, but to be quite honest, who cares at this point? But these things are irrelevant. I believe that institutions in most countries are strong enough that they can withstand even certain crazy elements within the political spectrum. This is what they were built to. And the second thing is, I don't see the argument to say, okay, those who are currently in charge are doing terrible things, but those who would be an alternative have a handful of members who have questionable views about history, so therefore they should not be in charge. I think that's an absurd way to look at this. Again, as I said, I don't agree with that handful of people, but it's a very simple thing for me. If they truly are Nazis or fascists, well, then there are laws in Italy and Germany for them to be banned. They are not banned. So I assume it's not as much of a problem as the media tells us to. So they should have every right to participate in the political competition. And if people vote for them, they should have a share in power. Unfortunately, I think very often people then think when they go to the voting booth, they say, I do agree with everything they say, but it feels icky to vote for them. And this is what I believe the media does very cleverly in many ways, right? Because they don't win the argument. I think the same, by the way, in my view, was true with Donald Trump. They never won the argument, but they painted it as if you vote for this person, it tells us something about your character, right? Only if you're stupid, you would vote for Donald Trump. Only if you're a racist, you vote for Le Pen. Only if you're a Nazi, you vote for the AfD. And this is working. I mean, I'm always disappointed, but it is working. I don't think it's true. But, we are human beings. We want to go along to get along. And you say, okay, for whom could I vote that if I go to a cocktail party and somebody asks me, whom did you vote for? That nobody's, kind of raising their eyebrow at me or that I'm not going to be ostracized or deplatformed or losing my job, which are all, by the way, of course, these are all real risks that these people face. So you then either vote for the left because that's fashionable, or you vote for the lukewarm right that in many areas we tend to forget, right? Van der Leyen is supposedly a conservative candidate, right? I mean, she's from the European People's Party, which is kind of the faction within Europe, the collection of all the quote-unquote conservative parties. I mean, she governs like a Green, she talks like a Green, but on paper, she's conservative. So there are plenty of people who vote for those who support van der Leyen, believing they gave their vote to a conservative movement, which in fact they didn't. Because the true conservatives that still exist in Europe are pretty much those groups that are usually labeled far-right. And I think that's the insidiousness of what the media has done successfully, right? Everybody is only so slightly right of center, but genuinely right of center, is immediately smeared as a fascist, racist, bigot, Nazi, you name it. And again, they dig deep enough, you will find, this is the problem nowadays, of course, with the internet, you will find some party member that sometimes at some point said something stupid in the past. I know that, right? And I'm not condoning it. But for me, it's like, to give a much longer answer than anticipated, but I think I have a good way to conclude it. Imagine this. You have, or somebody whom you love has a serious illness, and you have to pick the doctor, right, that treats either you or the person that you care about. What is the main criteria you're going to look at, right? You're going to look at, is this person qualified to treat the illness? Is this person qualified to save my beloved one's life? You will not say, well, that's the best doctor, but he once tweeted something that could be constructed as being, racist. You wouldn't do it like that. And I think this is the situation that Europe finds itself in. We no longer have the luxury to say that, quote unquote, the doctors we need must be somehow morally, pure. We need somebody who has a political program, who has a party program that addresses the issue that are really at the moment chipping away at the survivability of Europe. And I don't see this on the left. I see this only on the right, or what the media likes to call the far right. So this is my thing, right? I say, I want to pick the doctor who is best qualified, even though that doctor might, or parts of that doctor might be, have crazy views.
I would agree with you. As an an unwilling EU citizen, I'm a citizen of Croatia. My name literally means Croat, and I like to refer to the EU as the Fourth Reich. There's research that says Brussels has Nazi roots, or Bukowski and other Soviet dissidents have called it the new European Soviet. And again, I view it as this technocratic, anti-democratic construct, globalist construct that we need to get away from. And so despite this death grip for now that the EU might have on us, you mentioned Meloni. What do you see? Can some of these alternatives now realistically do? You tweeted out the other day. You said, "quote I will not stop repeating it. Almost everyone continues to underestimate Meloni." You said even Politico gets it. If she can hold on for 2 more years, we might have a Meloni Italy, Le Pen France, Trump US, plus an almost conservative Merz Germany, Kickl Austria to the south, and Orban's Hungary in the center. A Western Renaissance is possible. There's been some criticism about Meloni, where she came out initially a bit more anti-globalist, but she capitulated on some points. And then you've got Farage now saying he wants to lead a political revolution in the UK. So a lot of this stuff sounds nice. What do you think can be achieved now? You think we can have like a mini renaissance?
All right, that's good. Let's unpack all of this, because I think now we really get to the heart of what's truly important. So from a personal viewpoint, a full disclosure, right? I'm working for an institution that is very close to the Hungarian government. So I don't want to gaslight anybody. But the reason why I do this is because I believe in what the Hungarian government is doing. So I think that Viktor Orban is a fantastic leader of Hungary. I think he's right on almost all the issues. Actually, I think he's right on all the issues. However, again, I can criticize him, luckily enough, because the Hungarians still value freedom of opinion and freedom of speech. But I think the kind of being too confrontational can also be problematic. Orban can afford it because he has about 50% of support in Hungary, in some areas even more. So he's so unassailable within Hungary that he can afford to be confrontational with the EU or with NATO or you name it. Meloni's situation is different. Right? Meloni came into office and immediately attempt was made to ostracize her as a fascist. Then she's in a coalition government, meaning that she also has to work, and as many of your viewers probably know, and you yourself know, Italy tends to be notoriously hard to govern. So she started as a woman with Berlusconi, the late Berlusconi now, of course, and Matteo Salvini. So these are 2 men, right, who don't really enjoy playing second fiddle. And I would imagine they probably even less enjoy it if they play second fiddle to a woman. So she kind of had to make sure to keep the coalition together, try to kind of execute her political, particularly domestic program, but also ensure that she's not ostracized on the international stage. So I think what she's doing, again, maybe I'm too positive towards her, that's possible, but this is at least how I see it, that she says one of the key things she has to do is she needs to remain in power, right? That she cannot have the same fate as so many Italian governments in the past, that they are in power for 8 months and then there are new elections and she's out. And so far, I think with the exception of one local election in Sicily and I think one more in Sardinia, she has won, or her party have won every single election. In the European parliamentary elections, the only incumbent who won additional votes of all 27 states, right, was Italy. So that tells you something, right? So I think it would be too harsh to say she doesn't know what she's doing. And she understands, as you and your viewers absolutely know, whatever you think about the United States, having them as your enemy, or having them, let's say, as your unofficial enemy, a little bit like the situation is with Orban and the Biden administration, that is not helpful. She also understands, I think, that I don't think she agrees with von der Leyen on many things. But she knows if she's on good footing with Brussels, Italy still needs, financial support, right? They in many areas, they need the European Union. She knows that then she will not end up like Poland did under the previous right-wing government, or as Hungary is currently under Orban. So I agree with you that she did not do everything that even me were hoping that she would do. But my assumption is, at least that's what I'm hoping, is that she's playing the long game. You see something similar, I believe, who I think doesn't do it as cleverly as Meloni, is what Le Pen is doing in France. There is a reason why Le Pen, in my opinion, too quickly is disassociating herself from many of the other right-wing parties in Europe, because she she wants to keep her back free for 2027 when she's running for president, where she has a genuine shot to become the next president of France, which would honestly be huge. But I think what they're trying to do, consciously or subconsciously, they don't want to win the occasional election and then be in office. They actually want to make sure that their ideas start to be in power. Because one of the things that we see in Europe, and I think we also see it in other parts of the Western world, is it doesn't matter if you vote the left wing out of office, if the entire civil service, if all the bureaucrats, if all the institutions have been thoroughly infected and marinated in a left-leaning worldview. So you might be the right-wing president, you might be the right-wing prime minister, but if basically everybody on the lower level of your government, of your state, sees the world entirely differently from you, they will try to sabotage you. I mean, this is basically the deep state. But there was always this idea, the deep state, these are people, kind of getting together and sabotaging you consciously. And some of them do. But I think a lot of this is almost subconsciously. And what I mean by this is, so you have bureaucrats who believe the left-wing worldview is the right one. And if there is a president who sees it differently, or a prime minister, they have the obligation almost to sabotage said president or said prime minister, because what they do is wrong. Now, of course, you and I don't see it like this, but the thing is, they have this almost kind of, a religious fervor that in order to defend democracy, whatever they believe, or their democracy, I guess is the right term, or to do what they believe is the right thing, that everything is permitted. And again, I think the United States is a beautiful example for this. I mean, we have a situation in the United States where the party that claims they defend democracy, they are trying to throw the front runner of the opposing party into jail. I mean, this is unbelievable. But if you sincerely believe that everybody who sees the world different from you is either a fascist, a Nazi, a dictator, whatever it is, like the usual terms that are thrown around, then you feel you have an almost moral obligation to do whatever you can because the other side is so terrible. Now, we both know that the other side isn't that terrible. But I think if you go all your life to, you start in high school, maybe a private high school, and then you go to university, and, you run through all these institutions, you are marinated and socialized in this worldview. You honestly believe that the green outlook, or whatever you want to call it, is the only true outlook. And how do we know this? Well, we have the numbers to prove it. If at Austrian, German, American universities, 87% of the faculty identifies as either left or far left, I mean, you can imagine what the outcome is. I mean, you just mentioned it now in Spain, in Barcelona. If you offer a master's degree in degrowth, I mean, how much more obvious do you want to make it? Now, imagine you have a bunch of people who have their MA in degrowth, and then they run, let's say, an important division within the Spanish government, within the European Union. You can imagine what policies they want to execute and which policies they will try to resist. And so this is what I hope that we see with Meloni, with Le Pen. With Farage is, I think, made similar mistakes in the past. He did it again. He always tried also to disassociate himself from the other right-wing parties in Europe, which I think is a mistake. Like, they have to learn that you can march separately, but you have to strike together. I mean, this is, again, nobody asked that Le Pen endorses, for example, the AfD, or that she endorses the Freedom Party in Austria. But if you want to change the institutions, you have to work together. And I think some of them have understood this. I count Meloni in this camp. I think some of the others have not understood this. And there is no point for us in having somebody like Meloni, like Le Pen, who says all the things that we like, who tries to do all the things that we like, but then she creates such counter pressure from these institutions that a couple of years later she's out of office and nothing changes. And so this is why I remain optimistic about people like Meloni and Le Pen, that they say, listen, this needs to be lasting change. So we cannot do the whole let's have Trump for 4 years kind of as the American equivalent. And then, everything pretty much that he did was reversed with the next guy. So they need to be in power long enough that they can bring their people into office. That what we said before, right? That you have these people that were marinated in a left-wing worldview, that they can get people in that were marinated in a right-wing worldview. And I think that's the crucial thing to do.
And what you just outlined, I've told this story multiple times before. I used to teach at the top globalist university in Mexico, the Tec de Monterrey. Great place to work. I like it, but it's globalist. We've had Al Gore visit. We've had Bill Gates and Hillary Clinton speak at the online graduation ceremonies during COVID. It's basically the MIT of Mexico. And I was teaching international relations there many years ago. And I remember, I think it was 2016, right after Trump won. And we had the annual IR conference, and we were having a breakfast with like 20 undergrad IR students at the Mexican University, someone from the IR department, and one of the guest speakers. And they all across the board, I was the only outlier there. What you just said is, I just lived that experience of how that really seeps into the school and the administration. They all said, I wish Hillary had won, even if we could have cheated to get Hillary in to beat Trump. And I'm like, wait a minute, you guys are supposed to be the lights of liberty. I'm like, what is that they show their true face, the undemocratic nature of this left liberal globalism. And so that's just an anecdote. And then I've seen my students, they work for Mexican Forest Service, for the U.S. State Department. I've seen them on LinkedIn in photos with Trudeau. And so it's exactly what you're saying. They're now the Mexican elite, the American political elite, Canadian elite, pushing along this same agenda. Just real quick on Hungary, we read recently now the EU wants this insane fine, like a daily, I don't know, millions of dollars penalty for Hungary. Again, I would agree with you. I think Orban and the Hungary are total common sense. And now the EU wants to fine them. What's going on there?
No, but that's a wonderful example, right? Exactly. Because of Hungary's asylum policy, the European Court of Justice, besides, I think they have to pay 200 million, so to speak, immediately, and then 1 million per day. And you're absolutely right. And this shows you this, right? So you then have these institutions like the European Court of Justice that is staffed with people who look at the world as you just described at Monterrey, at the university in Monterrey. And it's like a word we no longer use that often, but it's like a crusade. Right, because they look at Hungary, they look at Orban, they don't care that 80%, 70% of the European people agree with his policies. Right, he is quote unquote the devil, and therefore he must be stopped by all means necessary. I mean, they did the same with Poland before they had the change in government there. Right, so this is you mentioned. I'm not sure if I would call the EU the Fourth Reich. But you are not wrong in describing it as an imperial structure, because ultimately that is what it is, right? You basically have the imperial center in Brussels, and they try to keep the quote-unquote provinces in line. And this is exactly what's happening. So if one of them, like Poland in the past, they have been brought back in line, I would say, unfortunately, or as you have it with Hungary, right? They kind of no longer are willing to toe the line in certain areas. So you find them, you withhold funds, you ostracize them, and you make their life miserable in the hopes, and I think this is what they're hoping for, is that at some point the electorate in Hungary is going to say, sure, things in Hungary are going well, but all the time being the black sheep, this is so annoying, kind of we want it quiet, we want it calm, so maybe at some point we vote for somebody else. I mean, this tells you that Brussels has no idea how Hungarians work, so that's the good news here, because they tend to react exactly the opposite way. But I think this, and we saw this, by the way, in 2020, I think, with Trump, right? That most people until COVID were fairly happy with the Trump presidency. But the Biden promise that, of course, he did not keep, that things will then be quiet and calm down and back to normalcy. Even people who profited from the Trump presidency economically and otherwise said, yeah, wouldn't it be nice not to have the constant headlines about the crazy guy in the news? And I think they try the same thing here. So you're absolutely right. And the point, once again, is you outsource something to an institution nobody really knows, nobody really understands how it works, like the European Court of Justice, and to use it then as a cudgel, right, to punish, in this case, the Hungarians. But those behind it can claim that their hands are clean, because it's not really Germany doing it, right? It's not really France doing it. It's not really Belgium doing it. It's kind of this body that we somehow all agreed on willing into existence. So this is, as you said before, this is, as always, I believe, the biggest threat are the nameless, if you want, or the almost unknown institutions and bureaucratic apparatus, or machines, if you will, that are on the forefront of this new form of tyranny, if you will. Very often, it really doesn't matter. It doesn't matter who is in office if there is an unnamed body who is actually in power. And I think this is what we see both in Europe, but we see in other parts of the world as well.
Yeah, you mentioned EU empire. European academic Wolfgang Streeck of the Max Planck Institute. He's come out and said, people can find his articles. He said the European Union is a liberal empire. It's a doomed empire. And I think that's what really gets me off, is this deception. They're like, oh, we're this democratic thing. It's like, and it's like Solzhenitsyn. They know that we know that, that they know it's an empire. Stop pretending that it's not. That's what gets me. And, I had on, he's a former professor of mine, Alfred de Zayas, fourth grandson of Cuba's president, former UN senior lawyer, UN special reporter. And he said in our last interview, that was 2 hours with him, he said, what do you do when the organizations that are there to protect your rights are actually the organizations that are betraying you, throwing you before the bus? That's the problem with the EU. We have allowed the institutions to be corrupted, to be penetrated by ulterior interests, by intelligence services. And he talks about Orban. He said Orban has every right to defend the identity, culture, traditions of the Hungarian people, every right. And the EU has zero right to interfere in the internal affairs of Hungary, but it's doing it. EU is actually morphing into another criminal organization. The EU is restricting the human rights of millions of people in Europe. And this is coming from, UN independent expert, UN senior lawyer. And I do want to ask you about the specter of war.
I have to intersect also for our viewers and listeners. This, by the way, was a fantastic podcast. I didn't know that he was your professor, but this was years ago. I read particularly his books on the treatment of prisoners of war and his work on the German military during World War II, and I found it one of the most enlightened, and I think one of the works that does great justice to what was happening in World War II. And that this is because it connects what we said before about this German politician and his comments on the SS. Yes, history is complex, right? And this is like Alfred de Zayas, I'm sure I'm butchering the way I pronounce his name. This is how you engage with these complex areas and these complex issues. And they need a 2-hour conversation. And this is sometimes I find where the right-wing politicians are a little bit clumsy when they kind of walk into traps of these complex issues and then try to summarize what happened or what they think about it in one sentence.
Yeah, Alfred is quite the character. And I want to ask you the specter of war. I just saw this morning. I haven't had time to listen to it. The former Czech president. I love the guy, Václav Klaus. I'm pronouncing his name wrong. I think with Michael Schellenberg, it was an interview where, the summary says, where he says, they prolong the Ukraine war to justify the existence of the European Union. This has been one of my thoughts for the longest time. They want to create this supranational structure. So they want an EU army as well. And so, what a great pretext, Ukraine war, to create an EU army and more centralization. And it goes on to say, and so basically, I want to ask you your thoughts on the Ukraine war. And we've got these calls for conscription now all over the place in Croatia, Serbia, Baltic countries, Rishi Sunak in the UK. Ralph, are you ready to lay down your life for Volodymyr Zelensky? Thoughts on the specter of a third world war or the use of, mini strategic nuclear weapons and whatnot?
Well, I think that the first thing to say about this is, and I'm glad you bring this up, right? It shows you really how detached the political elite is from the average person. Precisely as you said, according to internal polling for the AfD in Germany, right, for their voters, the most important issue, as it was for the Alliance Sarah Wagenknecht, which is basically the left-wing version of the AfD, for those who are interested in this, for them, the Ukraine war was kind of the main topic, even more, slightly, but still, even more than the issue of migration. And it's just absurd that a government, whether it's in Germany, whether it's in Great Britain, a government that is at the brink of no longer be seen as legitimate by its people, that these governments think they can conscript and send you into a foreign war. I mean, this just, it's an absurdity that I have hard to find words to describe, because exactly as you say, you must have the sense that the government you live under, right? First of all, I know this sounds like an old line, but I think it's a crucial one, really cares about you, right? As you said, it's kind of that is okay. This is kind of that you have a sense of emotional loyalty to the country and the government, like it happened for better or worse, right? Like it happened in 1914, like it happened in 1939. I mean, if this happens, it's I would say it's both a beautiful and frightening thing, right? If a country, if a government can mobilize its people, that is a force to be reckoned with, right? This is a very, very powerful thing. But this is impossible nowadays. Nobody's going to die for Rishi Sunak in Ukraine. Nobody. The idea in Germany. I mean, to give you one example, and this is a topic, but that again I think highlights this quite nicely. In Germany, currently, 51% of basic welfare, and in some areas it's 71% of welfare, goes to non-German passport holders. Now, imagine the situation. So you are a German guy, you pay taxes. So a significant number of the taxes you pay go to people that are not even German citizens. So then they take you, send you to the front lines to fight in a foreign war, whereas the guys who came to Germany, who are not working, who are getting cash from the government, are now also shielded from going to war. Right? I mean, this is, and I said this in other people. I mean, these are the conditions for a revolution, because you create, and I think that impression is correct. You really create the impression that okay, our government cares about everyone but us. And I give you another example to highlight this. The same politicians are the same activists, if you will. The same journalists, although these days they're indistinguishable from activists, who have the little Ukraine flag in their social media profile, go now out and say, in these days and after these European elections, even though it's a Euro championship now, the German fans should refrain from waving and showing the German flag. Right? And at some point, people say, okay, so you tell me as a patriotic German, a patriotic Austrian, I cannot show my flag, right? I cannot demonstrate my loyalty to my country. And then you come along and say, we need conscription because we need you to fight for the other guys against the other guys, right? And this is just something, understandably, where people are saying, no, we're not going to do this. So you're absolutely right. Which brings me to the other point. I don't think that the European Union really has, I'm not sure if, actually I think the Americans don't have one either. I don't think there really is a strategy when it comes to Russia and Ukraine. I really think they're winging it. But this is why, for example, they come up with these absurd ideas. I don't think they have any clear idea what to do with this conflict. One element of this goes back to what we said before, and I think this is a very crucial one, is at the end of the day, the political left, there was one thing, the political left was always jealous when it came to the political right. And I think that was patriotism, that was nationalism. They actually always wanted something to identify with in the same way as the right identifies with their country, with their nation, with their tradition. This is why they always come up then with, for example, a Pride Progress flag. They come up with all these alternative flags because they want to have the same thing. But again, they can't be nationalists, so they want something that is just like that. And I think Ukraine has become, in an almost absurd way, and I think for parts on the left, Palestine, by the way, the same thing, which is another can of worms, but I think it applies there as well, where they can kind of project that lack of patriotism they feel to their own country, they can project it onto something else. So the German Greens are the best example, right? The same party that openly said, Robert Habeck, that openly said that the idea of patriotism makes him throw up, is now the same guy who says there can't be any limit in the support for Ukraine. The same people who say Germany should have open borders, say the borders of Ukraine must be respected, down to the last square mile. So that tells you that there's a disconnect. And I think the reason is because, as I said, this is an almost, it's projection in many ways. Again, we can go into the conflict between Ukraine and Russia on its own as well. But I think if you look at the reaction of particularly the European left, I think there's a lot of projection there that they finally have a war they can before, right? Finally, they can have the kind of, rah-rah nationalism that they so mocked in the past. But now they can do it because it is for somebody else. I think that is a huge, huge part of the story, because ironically, one has to admit that, once again, the same parties who were starving the military for money, who were mocking people who volunteered for the army, who were against conscription for decades, as you correctly said, these are now the same people who say, we need to bring back conscription in case we have to fight the Russians. I mean, what happened? Right? 5 years ago, like they said, abandon the military, abandon the police, abandon everything, everybody who can hold a gun. And now all of a sudden we need to put the European Union on a war footing. The economy must produce shells, and we need to show that we can do without consumer goods so that the war machine can be put up to high gear. So what happened? And I think a lot of this is projection.
Yeah, and I view this as I think you illustrated it very, very well, and I see this as sort of like the birth pangs. Again, one of the things I'm obsessed with the topics is world government, right? And these are supranational structures that are now being built, and what you just gave an example of. It's almost like these are the birth pangs of them trying to create this greater structure above nationalism, which is why they need that LGBT plus. LGBTQ plus to infinity.
Don't even try.
Flag.
You get it wrong.
And that stuff's coming here in Mexico now. I mean, it's just going full on global. They're shoving it down everyone's throats. And just further thoughts on the West and the U.S. We had G7. Politico came out, said G7 is the weakest it's ever been. 6 lame ducks and Meloni meet the G7 class of 2024. It says this week's gathering of G7 leaders in Italy looks more like the Last Supper than a display of Western power. Arguably the weakest gathering of leaders the group has mustered for years. Most of the attendees are distracted by elections or domestic crises, disillusioned by years in office, or clinging desperately to power. I don't spend much time. I mean, every single day we got these videos of Biden coming out, and it's like you're utterly speechless. Like I almost think it's like a ritual. With the intent deliberately to shame, to bring shame to America, to have a leader like Biden. And it's nothing about left or right. Like this guy's just lost totally, and it doesn't make any sense why you'd have someone like that in power. And so sort of thoughts on the G7, the decline of the West. We have these rumors of the collapse of the petrodollar. I think that's I call it the multipolarista hype. All these people pushing for the whole multipolar stuff, they tend to exaggerate a lot, and so there really is no concrete agreement saying that Saudi Arabia, they're not renewing their petrodollar agreement. So thoughts on the decline of the West, G7, America, Trump, and whatnot.
Yeah, I mean, there is whether. Let's put it this way: nobody can deny there is certain change going on, right? I think everybody agrees with this. And one thing that we have definitely seen in the realm of culture, most definitely, I think the West is not as attractive as it was in the past. I mean, I think this is I guess another symptom that you can call is an element of decline, right? That the people around the world no longer necessarily look to the West as the role model. But to be quite honest, good for them. I would almost abandon also the idea of that. This is a difficult thing to say, and I hope I will not be misunderstood. But I would also kind of abandon the idea of maybe of crusades for human rights. At some point, this is the different countries, different cultures, different states. They need to organize themselves as they see fit. I would like, and I think everybody, even the Chinese and others would agree with this, right? There needs to be a set of rules. Right, some basic rules we can all agree on, because otherwise the world would just be chaos. And I think this is something that we have underestimated in the past. As long as there are power imbalances between states, hierarchies will emerge. So as you just mentioned, I think one part of the kind of extreme multipolarity approach is this idea that then you're going to have a world with all these different poles, and basically they're all more or less equal in a sense. I don't think this is how this works. One of the reasons why the world is as it is, because for a very long time, the United States was significantly more powerful than everybody else. I think in many areas, they still are. With the United States, we often confuse a weak administration with a weak country. So if you would have a president, I don't know if Trump would be the right one to do it, but if you have a president that really wants to unleash the full potential of the US, I don't want to be the country or the states that catches their bad eye. This is what we underestimate when you compare the United States and Russia, right? It seems not unjustifiably so, right? Russia was also severely underestimated, no doubt about this. But if, let's say, the US are gearing up for which hopefully is not going to happen, for full war, and the Russians gear up for full war, I don't think that the Russians really would stand a chance. And I think the Russians know this themselves as well. right? This is simply also when it comes to technology, all these kind of things. The United States do still have an advantage, and it must not be forgotten that yes, right. I think the idea that was floated in 2022 that the Russian economy and the Russian military will collapse and crumble and so on, that did not happen. No doubt about this. The Russian economy was severely underestimated. I'm the first one to admit this. I said it back at the day. I think that we significantly underestimate the Russians, but it has also to be said that they did not defeat Ukraine. Right. So this is another important element here. So the idea that the Russians can take on the United States if they cannot defeat Ukraine, I think this is something that we need to keep the right perspective here, to keep the right proportions. And the Ukrainians at this point are not getting they're getting some of it increasingly, but they're not getting the most advanced high-tech weapons from the West. So a lot of this, some of the things they got was pretty much what the West wanted to get rid of. Then there is some hesitancy, particularly by the Germans and others who want to kind of, at least in the past, right, they tried to constrain Ukraine's ability to strike into Russian territory. So there is a lot going on here that tells us that even though this is without a doubt a proxy war, that not both sides are using the same amount of commitment to this proxy war. I think that's an important element. And again, as I will immediately say, because I know there will be lots of comments now that, about why this conflict broke out and who's guilty and what Mersheimer says. And what I say, I'm happy to have that conversation, but I'm just talking about how the conflict is right now at this very moment. Right? Putin just a couple of days came out, or basically 2 days came out and said that if pretty much the Ukrainians would give up on NATO membership and would withdraw their troops from the areas that Russia claims for itself, he would immediately start negotiations and he would immediately agree to a ceasefire. Now, whether this is a sincere offer or whether it's just to get a breather to then prepare for another offensive, I don't know. Would he be willing to accept, for example, then have guarantees for the whatever remains of Ukraine? I don't know, right? Again, this is always, we have this attitude. You have the pro-Putin guys who says everything he says is sincere. You have the anti-Putin guys who say everything he says is a lie. I think the truth is somewhere in the middle. Because, of course, the Russians also need a strategy. They also, I would assume, know that this cannot go on forever. But at the moment, it seems that nobody really has a good idea how to end this thing. And what he also, of course, mentioned, and this is the big problem, is if both sides don't know what the end game of the other side is, well, I think it's very hard to negotiate. So because honestly, I don't know. Do the Russians want to annex all of Ukraine? Is it really just about small areas? Is it really just about the protection of the Russian? I honestly, that can all be part of the mix, but I don't have the self-confidence, for example, of a Mersheimer to say the Russians never wanted to annex anything in Ukraine, because I'm not entirely sure about this. If they would have made their way all through Kiev, and if they would have basically rolled over the country in March of 2022, I think they would have swallowed up a significant chunk of Ukraine without hesitation. Because again, historically, and that's not a big secret, Ukraine was, even Solzhenitsyn said this, right? Even if you look at the older writings of Navalny, you see it there as well. I mean, within Russian patriotic conservative circles, right, the idea that Ukraine is either part or at least within the sphere of influence of Russia, I mean, that is not something that is heavily disputed. And as I always say, diplomacy means not to tell the other side how to see the world, but to understand how the other side sees the world and then try to figure out what a potential compromise is. So I always like I always tend to say that whatever happened in 2022, was it really necessary for the Russians to send troops over the border, right? Was it really 5 minutes to 12? I don't know. I don't think that NATO membership of Ukraine was imminent. I think that the Russians could have driven a very hard bargain with the West without necessarily sending troops over the border. That gets my perspective. And honestly, I think the Russians knew that too. But they believed after they were victorious against Georgia, after the successful occupation of Crimea, in my assumption at least, they believed that this is going to be a quick, successful war, and then the rest of the world will basically have to deal with the facts on the ground. I think the Russians themselves were surprised by Ukrainian resistance. But be that as it may, right? I think the situation is now what it is. But at some point, somebody will have to come forward and say, okay, what is going to be how can this thing be concluded? And what worries me on part of the Europeans and the United States is I get the moral commitment to saying, not an inch of Ukrainian territory can be ceded to Russia. But is this realistic? Like, we have to ask that question. Is this realistic? And I think many of us, or in the commentariat, are way too sanguine about the risk of nuclear war. I mean, I'm very sorry, but Russia is a nuclear power. I mean, there's this whole talk you read in the Financial Times and The Economist, so don't be intimidated by Russia's threats of the use of, for example, tactical nuclear weapons. Well, I am intimidated by that, because when we look back at the Cuban Missile Crisis, that was on a knife's edge to descend into nuclear war. And everybody, I believe, if you go back to newspaper reports of the 60s, everybody was aware of this. And now you basically have a proxy war between a major nuclear power and other nuclear powers. And everybody just acts as if nothing in this situation can happen. And then you have to ask the question, is whoever has Crimea worth risking nuclear war? And again, I say this with great pain, but I think the answer to that question is no. And I think putting something on the table behind closed doors that says, okay, here are now the situation, the conditions as they're on the front. Here are the conditions on the ground. What would it take, right, for Russia to agree to, a Ukraine that there were security guarantees, ideally not just by the West. I think China needs to be part of it. I think India needs to be part of it. And what would be, an acceptable exit strategy? Now, if the Russians then say, right, we want half of Ukraine, we want the puppet government, okay, fine, that's not going to work. But if there is a way to say that they would be willing to accept, right, an independent, smaller Ukraine that also then has the right to chart their own path, excluding NATO membership, but maybe association with the European Union, I think that would be a way forward. And then what the Ukrainians basically have to do is kind of what South Korea did with North Korea. Become a prosperous nation, become a prosperous economy, show the other side that, that actually you do it better. And I think then gradually, probably some of these areas will voluntarily want to return to Ukraine. I know, I mean, this is very hard because we all have this almost, football mindset. You're either on team A or on team B, but it is unfortunately more tricky. And as I said, from a moral perspective, the situation is maybe clearer than from a strategic perspective. But the war now, the front line is what it is. And just to thumb your chest and say, we will never give up. And particularly, this is, I think, the big mistake on part of the Ukrainians. As the Vietnamese, or particularly the South Vietnamese, have learned in the 70s, when the United States say that their commitment to you is unwavering, that doesn't mean much. Everybody in the Arab Spring, from Mubarak to Gaddafi, they found out the same thing. So if you have to rely on the United States for an undiscerned or for an unknown amount of time, I think that's a risky bet. That the attitude is changing. The attitude in Europe is changing. The attitude in the United States is changing. And Putin knows that. So he says, I can wait those guys out. But I think if you want to get the public in the US, in Europe, kind of back on your side, is if you present them with a plan and say, okay, this is what we would be willing kind of to cede to Russia. And this is kind of quote unquote where our red line is. Because if you have a prospect of that this is going to end in some way, I think then people would be willing to support it because they know where the journey is going. But this kind of idea that there's like a blank check and the only party deciding how long this war is going to go on are the Ukrainians and the Russians, I just don't think that this is a long-term sustainable strategy. And again, I know it's a horrible situation. I mean, nobody denies this. And if Western diplomats would have been smarter in 2014 up to 2022, this conflict would have never happened. I agree with that, right? I think the idea of Ukrainian NATO membership was always a mistake. So all of this, when critics say this, all of this is true. But I think now we have to deal with the situation as it is, and it actually got worse instead of better. So yeah, I'm sorry. I wish I could give you a clearer answer, but it's a horrible situation.
Hopefully, no third world war, especially if no one, as you mentioned, shows up for conscription. Although, again, it's if no one shows up for conscriptions, then the elites might be like, okay, we got to launch nukes because we don't have an army. But is my Black Balkan humor here. And so, as you mentioned, the tides are turning in Europe. So hopefully we won't have to eat eat the bugs. And so, any other or final thought for us then?
Well, my strong belief is that because we talked about empire, right? But I always believe that empire is usually the consequence of if a country or a nation does things right domestically, right? So the Romans were politically, culturally, if you will, right? They were superior to everybody else, and this is why they became an empire. But kind of let's say their superiority started when they were still a republic. And then because they were better organized, they were better equipped, they were smarter than everybody else, this is how they got an empire. And I think we sometimes put the cart before the horse. So you have to do things right domestically. And if you do things better than everybody else, almost by default, unfortunately or fortunately, however you want to describe it, you probably will turn into an empire. And I think what we see happening in the West is we try to do, and by the way, I think that the Russians and the Chinese do the same thing. I think they try to do it the other way around, right? They sense or they have domestic weaknesses, and they think you can overcome domestic weaknesses with imperial policies. But I think that's not how it works. So even again, this was never understood also with Putin, right? I think it would have been much better if he would have focused on developing Russia domestically, because then he could have become so powerful that maybe, again, Eastern Ukraine would have said, oh my, we actually want to join the Russians because look how well they're doing. And I think the same is true within Europe and the United States. We have significant domestic problems, we have significant internal problems. I think we need to take care of them first and abandon the fancies of saving the planet, green deals and all these kind of things. We are heavily indebted. We have in many ways squandered the potential well-being of future generations. We're gonna leave them amounts of debt, amounts of inflation unseen for decades. And these are the issues at the moment that I think that are very, very crucial. So there must be a time of introspection and to take care of these issues first. We need to bring back manufacturing. We need to bring back production, right? To make sure that we actually have economies that do things. As we said at the beginning of our conversation, we have to start building things again. We have to start to free people from all these constraints of bureaucracies and red tapes. And I think we also have to give back to people a sense that it is okay to love your country. It's okay to be a patriot. It's okay to care about your culture. It's okay to care about traditions, because maybe, just maybe, then people would also start to have children again, which I think is the other kind of 400-pound gorilla in the room, that the entire world is in a demographic death spiral. So as you said, we have this absurd situation. We talk about a new world war between countries that are all on a course of dying out. I mean, there is no replacement rate in China. There is no replacement rate in Russia. There is no replacement rate in Europe. So these countries going to war is on so many levels absurd that it's kind of hard to describe. I mean, the Germans shortly before World War II, right? They always said, it was the famous saying, Volk ohne Land, right? People without land. It was always the whole Lebensraum approach, right? When Hitler said, we need to conquer land because there are so many Germans, basically we don't have enough space. That problem no longer exists. It's now the other way around. It's now not people without space, it's space without people. And I think these are significantly bigger problems, or these should be the problems that these countries should solve, because I think the world is going to be a worse place without Italians, without Japanese, without Croatians, without Austrians. I think it's going to be without Ukrainians and without Russians. I think it's as people disappear, traditions, languages, all of these things will go away, and I think that's a tragedy. And this is kind of would also be in connecting it to our previous topic. I mean, this is something I would talk about with the Russians and saying, listen, what's the point of conquering parts of Eastern Europe if there are almost no Russians left to do anything with it? And I think they know that. I think the Chinese know it. And I think this is something we have to talk about this much more. We are a species on course, with the exception at the moment in Africa, but even their birth rates are declining. We are a species on the way to self-extinction. We choose our own extinction. I don't know of any other species that has ever done this. We simply stop breeding. It's like a dystopian novel, if you will. It's like, I forgot the name of the author, but I think they made a movie out of it. The Children of Men, right? Yeah, it's. I think this is really something we have to take care of. There's a frustration and a kind of a anxiety of the future among so many societies on the planet that I believe drive many of those conflicts. I think we really underestimate this. It's a sad state we find ourselves in, but I don't think it's too late. I think the realization that this is happening is growing, and I hope that whether it's Taiwan, whether it's the Middle East, whether it's Ukraine, Russia, that at some point those in power realize that we have to step back from the brink of whatever potential disaster would happen if we go over the brink. And another last point, as I said before, we need to get rid of some of these, multinational, international, supranational institutions. People need to get their life back in their own hands. Countries need to get their life back into their own hands, because I think that if you feel that your life actually does make a difference, that you have control over your life, that you can build a future, then you can, that you can afford to feed a family, that you can provide for a family. I think then you would have more families again. I think you would have more community again. I think there's a whole lot that could be reversed. But the problem is, my last sentence, that we are still doubling down on the things that kind of work against that. More institutions, more centralization, more bureaucracy, more power to the state. And I think this is what we have to reverse more than anything else.
And I just wanted to read two more of your tweets again. You've got a great, your Twitter X account. I recommend people follow you there. It's a great resource. And you tweeted, fake transitions the Western media tells you about. Boys can become girls, girls can become boys. The quote, energy transition. The real transition the Western media does not tell you about. The demographic transition, as you just described. And the religious transition. There was another tweet you commented on where there's an Islamist party openly calling for Sharia law that has won a parliamentary seat in Belgium. And you say these stories are multiplying all over Europe. Since 9/11, the West has become more Islamic, in parts even more than the Muslim world itself. Instead of the Islamic world becoming more Western, we are losing the ideological war quickly. You're a prolific commentator. I was listening to you again on Kim Iverson the other day. You were on Neil Oliver's. You're all over the place. I think you write for Brussels Signal. Your links are in the description. Your link tree, your Twitter. Any other projects or best places people can find you?
No, that's all. And I mean, as you mentioned, we did. I'm actually very happy. I think we kind of avoided a little bit the topic of migration, which is fine, but it's also part of the story, right? I mean, this is just as a concluding remark on this, because I had also, when I was on Kim's show, I got some, which is fine. I mean, that's part of the debate. I got some blowback of not kind of being more appreciative of kind of the Muslim communities in the West. But in fact, I'm very appreciative of them. But it just tells me that a society or a civilization that no longer believes in itself is absolutely incapable of integrating people that come from a different civilization and society. And we see this. If you're a young Muslim man coming to Europe, I don't think we offer anything to integrate into. And as I always say, you cannot beat something with nothing. And Islamic identity or Muslim identity is something, but for many parts of Europe, European identity tends to be nothing in many ways, right? Or not an identity that people strongly believe in or are proud of holding. I mean, you see that shifting as well. Look at Ireland, right? I'm sure that some of your US listeners follow this, and you see it in other places too. So this is these conflicts will happen in the future. You see it in Great Britain as well. This is going to be the other side. Right? If you don't integrate people, and then you have a backlash against migration, there is a potential for this to turn, I wouldn't say civil war, but potentially at least to lead to significant amounts of unrest. So, as I said, I think the cultural, demographic issues are the most underappreciated of what's currently going on in the world.
All right. Ralph Schoellhammer, visiting fellow at Mathias Corvinus Collegium in Hungary. As always, thanks for being on Geopolitics and Empire.
Thanks for having me.
I hope you enjoyed this Geopolitics and Empire podcast. The website is geopoliticsandempire.com, and I encourage you to sign up for the free email list that goes out with each podcast and every weekend with a collection of news headlines. The newsletter and website are our last lines of defense. We're being censored and deplatformed. It's nearly impossible to find Geopolitics and Empire on the Google search engine. We've been blacklisted. YouTube frequently takes down our videos with strikes. Facebook restricts our page. Reddit and Twitter take down posts. And after the Associated Press mentioned geopolitics and empire in a 2021 article co-written with NATO, our Patreon account was terminated. Vimeo also terminated our Pro account. The best free way to help geopolitics and empire is to leave a review on Apple Podcasts or elsewhere and subscribe to all of our media channels. You can find the video broadcast now on 5 platforms: Odyssey, Rockfin, Rumble, BitChute, and Brighteon. You can find the audio broadcast on the podcast ecosystem: SoundCloud, Apple, Spotify, and so on. My current favorite social media channels are Twitter and Telegram, but you can also find us on Gab, MeWe, Minds, Float, VK, Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Finally, Geopolitics and Empire is in dire need of funding to continue. You can leave a donation, purchase a consultation with the host, or become a member to receive additional benefits. We also produce a weekly broadcast called Dissident Thinker for members and Rockfin subscribers only. We will continue to fight the good fight come hell or high water. Thank you for listening.